Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and disease of our times. My name is Jonathan Boyce, and it's my pleasure to bring to you today's episode. Virginia and returning guest Carole Holliday sit down to have a conversation about identity when grief threatens to take away everything we thought we knew about ourselves. We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Carole, it's so good to see you.
You also, you crazy friend of mine.
Do you know what? I loved your comment. Yep, our hair and makeup people didn't show.
Yeah. I don't know what it is. They keep standing me up. I guess I'm not tipping them enough. I don't know. I wish I had a team, but I don't. It's me solo.
Do you know what? Me too. I just want to jump right in and have you walk us through your book. I did a brief introduction of who you were, who you are to me, the impact you've had on my life in this fantastic book that you wrote. And you gave us a little bit of background about your daughter, encouraging you to write. Start us there. And then can you take us through every chapter of that book?
Sure. Boy, talk about the unexpected happening for those of you listening, if you're breathing, you've had loss, disappointment, and heartache, and you've got more probably coming. Hate to be the one to break that, but it's hard to know when you're in the total chaos of that. And Virginia, you use that term chaos so well, that leads to our dis-ease. It's hard to imagine when you're in the midst of that anything good can come of it. But yet for those of us of faith who've listened to Jesus's words, in my case, from the time I was 2, he tells us that good can come, right? And it's just hard to believe that. So sometimes we just cling on to things with our fingernails, hoping that someday we may find the fruit of that faith. As Virginia mentioned, my daughter, who's dear to Virginia and vice versa, she always believed when she saw her mom in tremendous heartache after the failure of a very long-term marriage and a lot of medical issues and financial fallout and career changes. She always knew that there would be something that could be redeemed from that. And so she decided that I should join a writing competition, which I grudgingly did, not enthusiastically. And I mentioned this on the first podcast, so I'll make it very brief. But so I got selected to join this writing podcast after submitting some of my midnight meanderings, I call them, mostly on pink Post-its. And I began a journey of writing about a topic that we all just love to talk about at dinner parties, grief, right? Grief, loss, disappointment, heartache. Wow, that's one that'll clear an elevator really fast. The weird thing is, as much as we don't like to talk about it, everyone on the planet has experienced it. So when I was going through this writing course, which led up to the writing competition, the agent who was working there said, write about what you Google at 3 a.m. And up until that point, I wasn't sure what I was going to write about. I was very private about the losses that had taken place in my life. As a matter of fact, people thought I'd gone into some kind of witness protective program because when my husband left, I had this incredible amount of shame that was heaped upon me. I put it there. I heaped it on myself, and which is a topic for another day. But
I also want to interject for context that you'd built an enormous business. You were a leader
we had sort
of
a public face. We had a public face, and then I built a cooking school. And this is all before, Instagram came about. And so we did this really organically from the grassroots up, and we built a pretty strong following in our community. And so we were known as a couple that managed to work well together, which we did. We worked very well together. So I was not the architect of my divorce. I saw it through. As a matter of fact, I was the one who filed for divorce after my children insisted that I move on with my life, saying to me, Mom, there's so many people that love you, but yet you sit here with those that do not. When your kids say that to you, it's a come to Jesus moment. So this was not something that I wanted. And it literally broke my heart in two and led to a lot of medical problems. But anyway, getting back to the book, I ended up saying, okay, if whatever I Google at 3 a.m., that's what I should write about. And I Googled, can human DNA be rearranged? What a weird thing, right? But this is where I think you want to go today, Virginia, that speaks to identity. And when I realized this is what I Googled, I did not know who I was anymore, hence the title of my book, I Don't Know Who I Am Anymore, which a very good therapist friend of mine says is the number one question that people ask when they come in to see a therapist. They sit down and they say, who am I, right? I don't know who I am anymore. So she goes, that's the greatest title ever, because everyone through heartache, loss, and disappointment, grief, will ask that at some point. So the root of identity, which is I think where you want to go today, Virginia, in our time together, is I thought my whole organic being has morphed into something I don't recognize. And how can I justify that? This is where that schism comes in that you do so well with R.E.S.T, Virginia, relational, emotional, spiritual truth, where all of those components have to align. None of mine were aligned. It was like a Jenga tower that had been destroyed, right? And all the pieces were out of place, or a jigsaw puzzle that was missing some of the pieces. I could not, for the life of me, figure out who I was anymore. And so that identity is what has to hold us through times like we're going through these days, where a lot of our traditional values, a lot of things that we held dear, a lot of things that we thought were going to be consistent in our life, changes that are good even that can cause stress, all of those shake our identity in some form or another. So my book actually just starts with that seed. Virginia, you say so many good things on your website. You didn't pay me to say this, by the way, but when you talk about stories, our narratives, that's what we tell ourselves. That's behind everything that we do. And so what better format to tell a story about my grief, loss, and disappointment without it being a salacious tell-all? That was not my intent. I think some people in my life were kind of disappointed about that. But I don't see that as me particularly. I wanted it to be not so much about what happened in my divorce, but what happened to me as a result of it. And how
good. Good.
It's like, yeah, the other stuff sells, I guess, but that's not where my interest was. And I had worked very hard to try to get all the pieces together. And part of being spiritually consistent with the other parts of your life, or, is to fend off any bitterness or anger. And I figured that's kind of one I want to hold to. Anyway, you talk about the narrative, the stories we tell ourselves is really the seed that embeds itself in our life. It was interesting. I had a conversation with a niece of mine, really smart young woman who is an RN in an inpatient eating disorder clinic. And she said, the problem is with these young women, primarily young women that she works with, is that the way they see themselves is not how we see them. So there's this constant breaking, this constant chaos and schism between our perception of who we are and how the world sees us. And that's what I wanted to write in my book. The chapters are basically Stand in Your Pain, which is acknowledging your narrative, acknowledging the lies you've been telling yourself, acknowledging the lies you've come to believe about what your future will look like and how broken you are and will remain. And then Find Some Friends with Stretchers, which Virginia is one of my stretcher friends, based on the story of the parable of the friends who cut the hole in the roof and laid the paralytic at the foot of Jesus, because Jesus didn't reward the faith of the one who needed to be healed, but rewarded the faith of the friends. So I thought, well, I need some of those friends. Finding healthy distractions, unlike not eating, which is a distraction that I used to try, but finding healthy ones, and then looking at life with new frames and new glasses, giving you a new perspective. Finding a safe harbor, which is finding the professional helper, retreats like what Virginia offers in her R.E.S.T retreats, finding people that have walked down that path that can help you. So the book starts with what the pain was so that the reader can identify with, oh, that's a grief. Because I found a lot of people, Virginia, think of grief as a very narrow path. It's only when you lose someone to death. Certainly it is that. But griefs can be identified in a lot of ways. Griefs can be terrible disappointments about the way you thought your career was going to go and it just didn't happen. Griefs can be the loss of a friendship. Griefs can be the loss of your financial and physical health. All of those things are losses. And when we gloss over and don't recognize that and say, well, there's some kind of hierarchy of loss and I should fall on the bottom because I didn't feel I was worthy enough to have a worthy grief. There was always someone who had a more horrible grief than me. And in life, that's true, right? but it doesn't mean that that doesn't hurt. And so I find a lot of people, especially people of faith, especially Christians, who say, well, I shouldn't feel that way because I should be grateful and I know what Jesus has done for me and all my griefs and sins to bear. We sing that song from the time we're little, and so we don't really acknowledge what grief can do to us. So it comes in all forms, all sizes and shapes, and that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about this book, is that I hope I give people the license to say, yes, this is a grief. For you, a lot of people with your background, Virginia, you find grief in a lot of our national distress. You find grief in the way people see themselves because that's your lifelong ministry. You find grief in people dealing with horrible disease. You find grief in a lot of different ways because you have given yourself the freedom to do that. A lot of people don't. They think, oh, I shouldn't feel that way, and they put it underneath the carpet, and then you run into real problems later on. So that's a long answer to a short question.
No, that was fantastic. And this is just chapter 1. This is just the beginning of the book, where you lay the foundation for the beauty and the ashes of that pilgrimage.
Right,
But something
right.
came to mind while you were speaking. What struck me while you were speaking, and I find myself wanting to hang on your every word, because if you say such profound things in simple ways, and the implications of much of what came out of your mouth, I would really encourage our listening audience to pause and really think about the facets of what you just described. But by way of summary, when you talk about grief, I live in a world where I very comfortably step into that space with people.
Yes.
Because I live R.E.S.T. So the grief that they're living through, I have complete different context for. But I did find...
So interesting, Virginia, right there. That is fascinating.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
But you know what I realized? That every 6 months, sometimes quarterly, depending on what I'm dealing with, but absolutely 3 times a year, I get in my car and I just cry. I cry from my office to the villa, which is the headquarters for R.E.S.T. And I realize that's when I mourn. And every quarter, pretty much 3 times a year minimum, I have to mourn that which I've grieved. I grieve very comfortably without being derailed or destabilized. But when I mourn, I have to give myself that space to just, it's a cleansing almost that happens. And I think in the course of our lives, we all experience, I love how you say grief, just loss, disappointment, and heartache. Loss, disappointment, and heartache. And that brings about a great deal of grief. And many times we're shocked in our grief. We don't even know how to process that grief.
Absolutely.
But those things that you described, I just, for some reason, it just hit me. Those are all external things that are accessible, that are visible, that are tangible, associated with very tangible circumstances. But when we mourn, that's a deep, hidden, that's soul work. And I think we need to develop the discipline of mourning. And for the first time, I understood how in the Old Testament, they hired mourners and they had those seasons.
They knew how to mourn. They knew how to mourn and to cry and to wail and to rent garments and put ashes on your head. Yes. That's what I mean, gosh, when the Old Testament talks about falling on your face, both in adoration, strangely, falling on your face can be both in adoration and in grief. Because as Virginia and I talked about, it's like those popsicles that used to come bundled together. Now they just give you one, but we used to get the double one, right? It'd be like one side was the grief and one side was the adoration. How could they both? Because they elicit the same deep emotions. It is the dark night of the soul. You know, it's Henry Nouwen, who I quote in my book through the chapter, Stand in Your Pain, because my son-in-law, Tommy, who's a therapist, had given me his book, Life of the Beloved. And he had the audacity.
It's an amazing book.
The audacity. Yeah, you have it too in your library, which I still need to come organize, by the way.
Yes.
But he had the audacity to find that, to say that the secret of life is going to be hidden in the things that hurt us the most. Well, what? I don't want that. You are comfortable with grieving, Virginia, because you have a very strong understanding of two things. Number one, who you are, your identity. And number two, of the fact that the scripture says, let us not mourn like those without hope. I mean, if we had no hope, if we had no future, we would be mourning a lot longer and probably never end. I mean, grief does have a tailing off. I would say it never totally leaves. It's always sort of sitting there at the table, but you just aren't setting a place for it necessarily and feeding
No.
it anymore. You're not giving it, amuse-bouche and appetizers and a cocktail. You're not doing that anymore. You know it's there at the table, but you're not feeding it any longer. Because why? Because you have hope. And because, like you said, we say beauty and ashes. Why in scripture would they put those two things in the same phrasing? You mean beauty and ashes? Really?
Exactly. When you just said, Virginia, you appropriate it, it's because, and this may be way out there, but it's because I understand that law, how our system is designed, how our central nervous system is organized,
Mm-hmm.
how our soul dispenses energy to the brain that reconciles in the body, all of those things. That's law. When you understand the lawful authority of order and design, you understand it, or you're willing to at least go to Google and ask questions.
Right.
Then you realize, once I understand that law, it is designed to be reconciled with liberty, people's capacity to self-govern.
Right.
Rest is really about law reconciled with liberty, people's capacity to self-govern so they can live free. And I think that, I know it's a mouthful, but that's what enables me to grieve daily. There's no question. I grieve daily, but I have so much joy in my heart because I know that there is a law, there's a structure, there's a system to things that is reconciled with my capacity, your capacity, our capacity to self-govern. And that is where we find freedom, which is what I say is healing. That's the recipe for healing. But Carole, I saw you on your deathbed.
Yeah, you did. Mm-hmm.
I remember driving away from the cottage, which, by the way, everybody listening, was an absolute magical place. Nobody wanted to leave.
No.
There wasn't a single person that wanted to leave. I mourned the loss of that place, I will tell you,
Yes,
till
me
today.
too. Me too.
But I don't think that story's over yet, but that's another story.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Anybody who knows Virginia, look at you people that are listening. If you didn't exactly follow Virginia's beautiful soliloquy there, don't feel like you're alone, because Virginia can process and think and communicate on a very layered level, very deep. And I've admired her so for that. And she probably thinks that deeply in Spanish too. I've never really asked you if you also think that deeply in your first language, I guess. But I think what you're saying anyway is that the strangeness of grief and mourning, which is the process of wrestling with that grief, will lead ultimately to freedom.
Yes.
And that's what, of course, rest is all about. That's what you're kind of chronicling of chaos, of understanding what it is, looking it in the face, what I call stand in your pain in one of my chapters, is your ability to do that allows you to grieve freely for and with others. That's what you have been called to do on this planet Earth. And because of it, others are getting their chaos in line and ordered. And the other thing is that the brain, as you've come to understand and study the brain, Virginia, if we could be 20 again and go back and be brain neurologists, right? But we're coming to understand, by we, I mean, not me, but the community of scientific brain people are coming to understand more and more how powerful the brain is. And certainly the brain was instrumental in my organic physical health tanking. What Virginia says is, and my doctor, who I love dearly, who has been with me from the beginning, and she's the one who looked at me and took my hand and said, Carole, he's not coming back. And then later on, she would say, you can't go back to that place because you will die. So that was all my
That's right.
brain being flooded with such a lack of understanding about my identity, which took its form in so many ways. And I had no freedom until that was solved. That's why the beginning of my book is all about a reminder of who I am as a daughter of the King, right? And that can sound very trite, but if you go back and really understand who I am, that I alone, not attached to any other person, not with a label that I'm wearing, not with anything I possessed, did my value come in that? My value came solely in the person, autonomous person that God made me to be, free in Him and free from the ravages that life can play on you. So, yeah, Virginia, you think so deeply. I wish I could go to 10% of where you go in your mind.
Well, you said it better. You said it better.
I said the
I've
junior high
loved,
version of your college.
No, it's important. These conversations are important. I think we all need each other. I live in my head. I live in dark places. I think I have as a child. And I often say, you talk about grief. I remember having to leave Montevideo, Uruguay, where I was born in the late 50s. And you talk
remember
in the
that?
late 60s, in the late 60s. Yeah. I was born in the late 50s, I was born 1960, but we left my country when I was 7 years old.
And you
But I
remember, what are your
remember
memories of that then?
confusion, chaos, and dis-ease that
Oh my
was
gosh, okay.
destabilizing. That's
That's how you ended up there.
That's how I ended up here where I am.
No, that's what I mean. I mean, if you
right.
think about the full circle. So here's a perfect example of you, Virginia, in a low moment, especially confusing to a child because they have no way of interpreting what moves their parents are making in the larger worldview, right? Here you take the worst thing that happened and it became the best thing that happened.
The best.
I'm not saying, and this is where I think sometimes Christians get a little crazy, is they say, oh, God wanted that to happen. No, God is a good father. God doesn't wish us to go through heartache. But what does He say? He says He will somehow wrangle that disappointment in your life and change it and transform it, not take it away. But He did not cause that. He didn't want Virginia as a 7-year-old child to feel hopeless, to feel confused, afraid. I can't imagine all the feelings. You don't speak their language, all of this, Virginia. Yet you've come full circle. And here you sit taking and speak to people in a whole different language, like we just heard a moment ago. It's not another foreign language in that it doesn't come with certain words, but it comes with an intention and it comes with an acute realization of the pain that someone is feeling. I think that only can really happen when you've walked through the fire yourself. It doesn't mean you can't be empathetic if you're not, but I'll tell you what, if you right now are going through grief, disappointment, and heartache, I just pray that you say, God, use this. Use this in my life because somehow He will, and you will always remain what I call squishy to someone else and their pain. And for those humans who see others in pain, that is a gift that you can give the world that can shout, I am a follower of Jesus. That's what I think.
I think of the listener right now who says, thank you very much. I grew up with people of faith, and I no longer align myself with a church. Mm-hmm. Not only that, I don't know if I even believe in God anymore.
Got it.
Because the people that aligned themselves with that worldview have been a great disappointment to me. And before I ask you this question, I'd like you to comment on that. I have great compassion, empathy, sensitivity, and I'll say I stand in agreement with that perspective. For example, I was very offended when we called a generation snowflakes. I thought, well, if they're the snowflakes, you're the storm.
I love that.
Yeah. If they're the snowflakes, you're the storm.
Right.
We are the storm. Yeah. They are snowflakes. If that's how you choose to address them, or that's how we choose to address them, then we have to look at the fact that we're the storm. And I think that requires a lot of thought and reflection. And honestly, we'd better stop and think about how this happened. And there's Perhaps they don't have an identity. Going back to your concept of identity, perhaps a lot of the confusion and chaos and disease that they've seen in your home, in your church, in your community, in your political views, and the things you said, and then contrasted by the things you did, caused them so much dismay that honestly, they just don't want any, but we brought it on.
Yeah.
And so this concept of identity has really far reaching implications. And I think we have to not just look at, gosh, how did we get here? Why is everything such a mess? We have to go right where you start in your book. And that's, wait a minute, what is happening to me? Where did I lose myself? What is confusing? What is chaotic? And by the way, nobody took anything from me. My ex-husband didn't take anything from me. What did I give away? What did I forfeit? When did it start? Why
what did I
it
hand
start?
over? Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I think that's true. I think, well, first of all, let me say this. Anyone who knows Virginia knows she's a woman of very strong convictions, political and otherwise. But if you listen to her heart, it doesn't mean that regardless of where you fall on whatever spectrum or measurement you want to lay down on the line, empathy should be present at all times if we call ourselves followers of Jesus. And so much of what she's talking about, I have compassion also for those who question where their faith is gone, because we've never seen a situation in our country where people are so intolerant of others' opinions and so willing to criticize. You only have to spend 30 seconds on X/Twitter to see that on every side, on both sides. But, I will say this. I've thought a lot about this, Virginia, because I have a lot of friends who either themselves are experiencing this or their children, their grown children are, a feeling of like, where did my usually childhood faith go, or where am I going away from it? One of the chapters I write in my book is called Thin Spaces, and it's what I call that space that diminishes, the space between heaven and earth, which collapses upon itself and overlaps, and you experience the wonder and awe of God in the earthly realm. And that's, I think, what Jesus meant when he said the kingdom of God is here and now. We're looking for a new kingdom, which will in fact come, if you believe that, and will be a new kingdom and a new earth, and all these old things will pass away, where there'll be no more crying and tears. Yes, but we have the opportunity to bring heaven to earth now, and that's what I call those thin space moments. Wonder and awe, I think about. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go back just a minute and just digress to what you wrote this on your website, Virginia. It's genius. Let me see if I can recite it correctly. Hardened hearts wander in fear and suffer in solitude, and tender hearts wonder in faith and rejoice in reconciliation. So it's a wander versus wonder, okay? I believe that my God is a very big God. And sometimes I grieve friends or family members who no longer feel as strong in their faith or in their identity. But I think to myself, no, I serve a big God. There is a wonder and an awe that comes with God. And I believe he will honor those who truly are wandering, trying to find their way. It's not my job. It's not an onus upon me to sit people down and tell them how they should change and be different.
And what their identity is in the process, right?
What are the greatest commandments? Love God, love others. That's very clear in scripture what I am to do. So for those who have stepped away, I believe in the wonder and the awe of God and the power that carries with it. And I believe that some of those people will turn and find a renewed faith and a renewed vision. And this is a time of division in our country that we need to pray over, but it's temporary. It won't be here forever. I have great faith in the future and what it can hold. I really do, because of the awe and wonder of God that you address in this little part from your website.
Yeah. Do you know, think about this incredible conversation, at least for you and I, because we don't get to talk and spend time with each other as often as we'd like. We're plowing our respective little plots
North
of
40s.
land.
North 40s.
But I think that whole concept of identity, that concept of putting all the chips on the table, the good, the bad, the ugly, but of reflection, is the invitation in the early chapters of your book. And I was so compelled by how you did it. I love how you invite people into that space, and then the food and the recipe facet and component and everything that comes with that, that you weave into that process. It's just beautiful. I think it's such a unique piece. I want everybody to experience that which you invested so much into, because it's really it's a pilgrimage, but it's a documentation of the pilgrimage of what we're discussing right now.
Right. I mean, look at, it's a way station is how I would describe my book, because, I grew up watching a lot of baseball games with my two sons, and we used to have tournaments, and we always say, oh, we don't want the one and done, which is you play one game and you're out. You want the double elimination, right? Grief is not one and done. If you're engaged in life, I mean, Virginia, this is you in spades and, to an exponential degree. But if you're engaged in life, you're going to have these things. And so you stop at the way station, you're the pilgrim along the road, and you refresh, you rest, like you say, and you do so well, Virginia, and all your teaching and all your retreats. You rest and you gird your loins and you take off again, and the next disappointment, loss, or heartache will come. And you deal with it again. That's life. This is life. It's a mixture of all of the good and the bad together, right? And we can have faith and we can have sadness. And that's okay. You're not a bad person or a bad Christian because you feel sad. You feel
or a bad
loss
mom
and
or a bad wife.
No,
right?
Like if you're struggling as a mom and you've got difficult kids. I mean, my daughter said this to me the other day. And as a matter of fact, I wrote about it in a devotion that I'm contributing to. And I said, my daughter looked at me the other day and said, I think that life is mostly just hard now, Mom. Well, I didn't say, no, you're wrong. You're a woman of faith. You can't. I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. I identify with what you're saying. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm hearing that is a very true statement. So it's okay. It's okay. It is temporary. But right when you're in the midst of it, it feels like it's never going to end. You have to give people that.
So good. Carole, this is so rich. These conversations are significant. They're important. And I know you share my heart. We want to invite people to think differently, to discuss things differently, perhaps, and to live differently with greater measures of freedom and hope and faith and love. Yeah. And it's to that end that both you and I labor. In the next segment, Carole, would you continue to take us through your book?
Sure.
Because you say so many relevant things that I think are instrumental in helping us deal, face, and thrive.
Yeah, because that's the goal.
That's right. Thank you.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about R.E.S.T, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of R.E.S.T. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of R.E.S.T, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.